welcome back to Unity for J. I have the great pleasure of introducing you once again to Ross Cameron, who is a former member of the Australian Parliament and host of Sky News, the program Outsiders, which is on 3 times a week. And as Ross and I decided, it sort of covers the humanities. Anyway, welcome, Ross, to the vigil.
Well, it's good to be here. I'm at my post, in my place, candles lit, ready for the service.
Good. So, first of all, I'm just going to cut right to it. You covered a speech that Prime Minister Turnbull gave in 2011 on your show today, I believe.
Yes, that's correct.
I would love you to read it because I think it will probably put in sharp contrast the difference between wanting to get into power and then arriving in power. So please take it away, Ross.
Oh, well, that's an invitation I'm unlikely to decline, Vivian. Thank you.
Please.
I should acknowledge to our fellow vigilants that the story originates in the Sydney Morning Herald earlier this week, 1st of August, by Nick Miller, who writes that Julian Assange's core supporters initially hoped that Malcolm Turnbull would push the US to end its pursuit of the WikiLeaks chief, according to private correspondence leaked to the media. And the article goes on to say that they based their expectations on the Australian Prime Minister's previous history of supporting free speech and comments he had made about Assange before becoming Prime Minister. And it says, but Assange himself was dubious that Turnbull's deposing Abbott as Prime Minister in 2005 would aid his cause. So far, the money, Julian Assange's judgment has been proven regrettably correct. The article goes on to speculate about why Malcolm Turnbull may not have taken up the cudgels in his behalf, speculating by reporting on this conversation which was taking place among a group of trusted sources to WikiLeaks and Julian in Twitter, a kind of like informal, not kitchen cabinet, but just advisory discussion group among some who trusted each other and WikiLeaks. But the source, what happened was, according to the Sydney Morning Herald, in September 2015, when Turnbull replaced Abbott, the chat group fired up as Assange supporters did their homework on the new Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, and the article cites various views that were expressed about Malcolm Turnbull, which I could reproduce for you, but I'm not going to. Our listeners are welcome to go onto the Sydney Morning Herald and look up Nick Miller's article, Turnbull Disappoints Assange on Free Speech, from 1 August 2018. But the point is that the article, the Sydney Morning Herald, goes on to say that the group were excited by the discovery of a speech that Malcolm Turnbull had made on the 31st of March 2011, when he wasn't even leader of the opposition. He was, I think, the Minister for Communications in the Abbott opposition. And he had decided to accept the invitation of the Sydney University Faculty of Law, or alternatively, he may have made an overture to the faculty, which they had accepted, in which he intended to lay out, as Minister for Communications and as a former barrister, his ideas on the role of law in the age of the internet, with reference to 2 specific cases, both of which involved the leak and subsequent publication of what had been at one time confidential and secure information. The first case being the spy catcher case, which was really for Malcolm Turnbull this sort of catapulting event the pinnacle of his professional career as a lawyer. He subsequently became an investment banker, but as a lawyer, this was the high watermark, in which he and his wife Lucy together defended the former MI5 spy Peter Wright in Wright's efforts to publish his memoirs called Spycatcher. Wright by that stage was seeking to write and otherwise live a quiet life in Tasmania, and Malcolm Turnbull had secured the brief to represent him, because when he went to publish his memoirs, the British government under Margaret Thatcher took exception to the idea that he was publishing this sensitive information. And Malcolm defended him against the British lawyers who sought to shut down publication, and he defended him successfully. And it was regarded as a fairly virtuoso performance by the Turnbull couple, doing much of the work of drafting affidavits themselves, because the publisher had been advised from the most eminent silks in the golden, at the London bar and among the golden circle law firms of London, that the former spy had no chance and that the British government would certainly shut him down. And the second case to which Malcolm Turnbull referred in this speech to the Faculty of Law at Sydney University was the case of Julian Assange. And since this speech is now 7 years old, but a number of factors inclined me, Vivian, to accept your kind invitation to place a decent chunk of this speech on the record, because I regard it as one of the most beautiful defences of Julian Assange that I have ever read. There have been some very eloquent exponents of the cause and defenders of WikiLeaks and the principle of disclosure. We may not wish to, speculate about who our favourites are. I mean, you will no doubt have a view, as do I. I mean, look, if you get stuck listening to Kim.com on any subject for any length of time, it is like wandering through a sort of palace of exquisite intellectual pleasures. But this speech by Malcolm Turnbull, I regard as Australia's now Prime Minister, his very best self. This is the better angels of Malcolm Turnbull, not weighed down by the cares of high office or indeed the bullying tactics of a range of Australia's allies, most notably the United Kingdom and the United States. This is Malcolm Turnbull as a free man, when he still had a beating heart of valour and a kind of resonance with the vibration that Julian Assange was giving out from his confinement in the Ecuadorian Embassy. So, are you ready?
I am. Take it away, Ross.
Malcolm Turnbull, March 31, 2011, to the Faculty of Law, University of Sydney Distinguished Visitors Program. 220 years ago, the United States of America ratified the Bill of Rights, the most influential clause of which is the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Ever since then, in America and in every other society inspired by an ideal of freedom, including our own, there has been a contest between governments who wish to keep their activities secret and those among their citizens who wish to know what they are up to. It has ever been thus. And when societies are threatened by war or other threat, civil liberties in general and freedom of speech in particular are always under threat or constraint. To that anniversary, perhaps we should add another pending one. In September this year, it will be a decade since the Twin Towers were brought down by Al-Qaeda, and what has been described as the war against terror began in earnest. So before turning to the case of Julian Assange, spy capture and the role of the internet, it is worth reflecting on the cause for which we stand and when we must fight. It is freedom. In 1986, Lucy, that's Mrs. Turnbull, and I represented a former MI5 officer, Peter Wright, in his efforts to publish his memoirs, Spy Catcher. Mrs. Thatcher, then Prime Minister of Britain, was determined that no former MI5 officer should ever be able to write about his work, regardless of whether the information was still confidential, impacted on current operations, or was otherwise any real detriment to intelligence services. So you can see, Vivian, I think he's quite lucid, isn't he? He's got a nice turn of phrase. He speaks with a kind of legal command, the confidence of a man of his generation. He says,
he sounds like a, sorry.
Go ahead.
He sounds like a man preparing himself for office.
Well, you know, my thesis, and I will perhaps interpose a few editorial comments, is that at the time, Julia Gillard was Prime Minister, and we had these three lawyers, each contending for leadership, Malcolm Turnbull, Tony Abbott and Julia Gillard in the job. And they were all bustling for the top job. And I believe that Malcolm Turnbull wished to demonstrate to Sydney University's Faculty of Law that he was the preeminent lawyer among the candidates for leadership on offer, and also that he was a more small L liberal temperament than Tony Abbott, who was seen as a more sort of reflexively obedient to our partners such as the United States and others. So here we go. While it is true that some of the best legal minds of the day had advised Peter Wright's publishers he had no hope of success, we always thought that the old spook turned Tasmanian horse breeder would succeed. So Malcolm is saying that even though these great legal minds were saying my client had no chance, we knew he had a chance. And then Turnbull goes on to cite the reason why, which is absolutely compelling from an Australian legal standpoint. That was because of a decision of the High Court of Australia in 1980, Commonwealth versus Fairfax, in which Sir Anthony Mason, Justice, perhaps Chief Justice of the High Court, had held that a government could only restrain the publication of confidential information if it could establish that the information was still secret, hit pause. By definition, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, vigilantes all, if Julian Assange has the information, it is no longer secret. Okay, if Julian has it, there has been a breach of security, there has been a leak by someone. And according to the very first test set by the High Court of Australia about whether an Australian court should ever collude in the suppression of publication, Justice Sir Anthony Mason says, if the information is no longer secret, it cannot be suppressed. The second test, which the High Court produced in the Commonwealth and Fairfax, most importantly, that its publication would cause real detriment, not just embarrassment, public debate and controversy. So this is the judiciary at its finest. This is a judiciary unbowed and uncowed by a powerful executive in the way that we have recently discovered the judiciary of the United Kingdom under justices like Her Eminence Arbuthnot, who recently threw out Julian's absolutely compelling case to destroy the warrant for his arrest relating to a complaint which had never been formally made in a charge of any kind by the government of Sweden. But it was thrown out because the UK judiciary has just become corrupt. It is no longer enjoying a direct genetic relationship with the British common law as articulated by people like Blackstone, going back to the Magna Carta and even beforehand under King Alfred, when the Anglosphere adopted the idea that an accused is innocent until proven guilty. That idea seems to have just completely disappeared from British law. Once the towering pinnacle of authority in wisdom. And here we have a lovely moment in Australian law where a judge has stood up to a government and said, I'm sorry, sunshine, no, this is not happening. He goes on to say, and listen to this beautiful ratio, which is so perfectly distilled, as if in accordance with the principles of the Roman Stoics, who so greatly valued brevity. It is unacceptable in our democratic society that there should be a restraint on the publication of information relating to government when the only vice of that information is that it enables the public to discuss, review and criticise government action. That's the High Court. Malcolm Turnbull goes on, having delivered this killer blow, which indeed would be my opening statement if I were Julian's counsel before whatever commission or kangaroo court or special prosecution or whatever name the United States wishes to give to the quasi-judicial process which appears to be about to take place, demanding the presence of Julian Assange, a journalist, a publisher, a very good one. Whatever process is about to take place, that would be my opening statement. Sir Anthony Mason from the High Court of Australia, 1980, the Commonwealth and Fairfax. Malcolm Turnbull goes on to say, it was a fundamental part of our jurisprudence that a court would not restrain the publication of confidences if their disclosure would reveal the commission of crimes and unlawful acts. Now, if anyone can say to me that the publication of the US diplomatic cables did not reveal the commission of crimes, one of those crimes even may be, for example, the leaking of the information in the first place, depending upon one's level of protection for whistleblowers. However, Turnbull goes on. It is worth remembering too, in the context, the words of US Supreme Court Justice Black in the Pentagon Papers case. The guarding of military and diplomatic secrets at the expense of informed representative government provides no real security for our republic. So this is a rejoinder from the Supreme Court of the United States at its finest. The framers of the First Amendment, fully aware of both the need to defend a new nation and the abuses of the English and colonial governments, sought to give this new society strength and security by providing that freedom of speech, press, religion and assembly that should not be abridged. Spycatcher ticked all the boxes in Commonwealth and Fairfax. Fairfax, of course, as you are no doubt aware, Vivian, eminent masthead, collection of mastheads, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Melbourne Age, the Australian Financial Review. And it was indeed, up until a deal was announced a couple of weeks ago, it was the longest running family-owned newspaper in the world, Sydney Morning Herald. Originally, the Sydney Herald established during New South Wales's colonial period. But nonetheless, the British government had easily obtained an interlocutory injunction on the basis of breach of confidence in the Spycatcher case. Our main argument was there was nothing in the book which any longer had the requisite quality of confidence, and probably the most important document in the case was a weighty volume called the Consolidated Particulars of Public Domain, which proved line by line there was absolutely nothing in the book which had not been published somewhere else. He goes on. I'm going to hit pause on Spycatcher because that's basically Malcolm sort of peacocking his beautiful feathers with this stunning victory as the background to his case to the law faculty of Sydney University that he was a man who understood the rights of the individual and the importance of their protection under the rule of law. So we have, he says, the High Court was very clear in declaring that an Australian court should not act to protect the intelligence secrets and confidential political information of a foreign government, even one which was a very friendly one, and even in circumstances where the Australian government requested the court to do so. So it's a very, very high test established by the High Court. I stress this point, and this is where the juice comes. This is the sexy in the speech as far as Unity for Julian goes. I stress this point because it has a current relevance to the case of Julian Assange, who you will remember our Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, described as someone who had broken the law by publishing the contents of confidential US State Department cables, as indeed Julia Gillard had made that claim, as Prime Minister against an Australian citizen. Disgraceful. One, perhaps the nadir in defence of the citizen by an Australian government. We might have done worse to a World War I deserter. It's possible. Might have been left in a brothel in bloody Cairo or something. But here, these remarks by the Prime Minister, here we go. He says, not only was it perfectly obvious that Julian Assange had broken no Australian law. Okay, hit pause, Vivian, for the benefit of our audience. I can hear a demand for an encore of that sentence from Malcolm Turnbull to the Faculty of Law at Sydney University. He says that not only was it perfectly obvious that Julian Assange had broken no Australian law, and despite the strenuous efforts of the American authorities, there is no evidence to date he has broken any American laws. Hit pause. Okay, this is the guy we are prosecuting, we are hounding from hell to purgatory and back to hell again for the last 7 years. He's broken, according to Malcolm Turnbull, no Australian laws and no American laws. Yet we're persecuting this bloke. He says that the decision of the High Court in Spycatcher made it quite clear that any action in an Australian court to restrain Assange from publishing the State Department cables would have failed. Malcolm Turnbull, barrister, Minister, Shadow Minister for Communications in the Abbott administration, subsequently Minister for Communications and Prime Minister today. Broken no Australian laws, broken no American laws. Then we go, no Australian court would have suppressed the publication of any of the material published by WikiLeaks and, we might say, multiple Australian and international news media. No Australian court would have suppressed their publication had it been requested. These remarks by the Prime Minister, Gillard, which were echoed by her Attorney General, were particularly regrettable, according to the member for Wentworth. Not simply because she was so obviously in error from a legal point of view, but whatever one may think of Assange, he is an Australian citizen, period. This Australian citizen, Vivian, if I may interpose, at risk of interrupting the Prime Minister's poetry, does not possess a current Australian passport because Malcolm Turnbull refuses to give him one.
Sorry, I got to ask you, he officially refuses to give him one, or he just hasn't volunteered a passport?
Julian's passport expired 2 years ago. The process for renewing an Australian passport is to apply online. It takes about 10 days, as long as you have no criminal convictions, which Julian Assange perfectly satisfies. Yet the Australian government, its Minister for Foreign Affairs, its Attorney General, and its Australian High Commissioner in London, former Senator George Brandis, have not gotten around to renewing Julian Assange's passport for 2 years. You have to understand, you may have thought Australia was a first world country, Vivian, but the reality is the value of Australian citizenship is very low if you are a citizen in trouble under intense intimidation by the intelligence agencies of about 7 or 8 countries. More importantly, perhaps, at the time he was being described as breaking the law by Ms. Gillard, prominent American politicians and journalists were describing him as a terrorist, and in some cases calling for him to be assassinated. Sarah Palin, possibly the next US president, remember this is written in 2011, called for him to be pursued, quote, with the same urgency we pursue Al-Qaeda and Taliban leaders, end quote. No doubt her supporters were able to read what they liked into that remark. So this was the time when Malcolm Turnbull had quite a sensitivity to what people might read into threats towards Julian Assange. Regrettably, that sensitivity seems to have dimmed like a star running out of helium. While Assange is no doubt quite safe from assassination, I'm happy to hear argument. I regard that as a fairly cavalier statement in 2018, after somebody like the Secretary of State of the United States in a security meeting with 15 people said, "Can't we just drone this guy?" Which then produced, according to eyewitnesses, twittered murmuring half laughter until everybody realised that the Secretary of State of the United States, Hillary Clinton, was deadly serious. I'm not quite as confident as the member for Wentworth in relation to that casual assertion. Nonetheless, this is the most compelling sentence of the speech, Vivian. While Assange is no doubt quite safe from assassination, when an Australian citizen is threatened in this way, an Australian Prime Minister should respond.
Well, you better quote that to him on Twitter as soon as you can.
I'm going to go on. I mean, it is a kind of crescendo. I appreciate we've got sort of 5 or 10 minutes left, but there's a couple more paragraphs I'd like to put on the record, if you will indulge me.
Listen, I think what you're reading is almost, well, it's a very, very important statement that all Australians and anybody interested in Julian should hear, because they should pick Prime Minister Turnbull up on his original declaration and call him on it. Call him on not following through on that, or at least asking him why he is now not taking that position. So please carry on. I think this is very valuable. And remember, this is going to go on YouTube and people can watch it over and over again. So, you know, keep going.
Thank you. Julia Gillard could quite properly have deplored his publishing of confidential information, sympathised with our embarrassed American allies, but at the same time registered our profound unhappiness that an Australian citizen is being threatened in this way by leading figures in another country whose commitment to freedom of speech and the rule of law we would traditionally regard as being no less than our own. She might even have taken the time to ask how on earth the United States security arrangements were so slack that hundreds of thousands of highly confidential documents could be copied onto a disk by a 23-year-old Army private, Bradley Manning. To which I would say, good question, Prime Minister. After all, let there be no mistake that Assange would not have been the subject of this kind of attack had he been an American, let alone an American journalist. Can you imagine one of Mr. Rupert Murdoch's employees at Fox News calling for the assassination of an editor at the Washington Post or the New York Times, or indeed any US citizen? What if the US State Department cables had been published by the Wall Street Journal or Fox News itself? Indeed, I understand many of them were subsequently published by the Wall Street Journal. Do we imagine that Congressman blah blah, the incoming chair of the House Homeland Security Committee, would have called for News Corporation to be declared a foreign terrorist organisation, or compared Mr. Murdoch to Osama bin Laden? So here we have an Australian expressing the natural sentiment of solidarity with his mate, his fellow citizen, who is the one who has been picked out of the crowd and is being belted around the head and ears repeatedly by the biggest bully in the playground. And what of Prime Minister Gillard? She was more than happy to accuse Assange of acting illegally, but I didn't hear her describe the editors of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald in those terms when they published the contents of the State Department cables given them by WikiLeaks. To which I say, encore, good point, well made, counsel for Mr. Assange. Here we go. It is easy for politicians in the midst of a media frenzy to jump on the bandwagon and compete to denounce the villain of the hour, especially if he or she is seen as vulnerable or lacking in power. But leadership, and in particular national leadership, requires cooler heads. Assange's conduct may be misguided, even reprehensible, but no Australian Prime Minister should accuse one of her own citizens of breaking the law when there has not even been a charge, let alone a conviction. It is a pity the commentary, both political and journalistic, did not retain the level-headed approach taken by Secretary of Defence Robert Gates, who responded to the release of the cables by describing the leaks as a, quote, not a meltdown or game changer. He said, by describing the description of the leaks as a meltdown or game changer as being, quote, fairly significantly overwrought. That was the US Defence Secretary. Secretary Gates observed, quote, many governments, some governments deal with us because they fear us, some because they respect us, most because they need us. We are still, essentially, as has been said before, the indispensable nation. No lack of self-assurance in the American military machine. Factually accurate. So other nations will continue to deal with us. They will continue to work with us. We will continue to share sensitive information with one another. Is this embarrassing? Yes. Is this awkward? Yes. Representing Peter Wright all those years ago, we looked in vain in Whitehall for a sensible, cool head like Secretary Gates. After all, Wright was an old sick man, and we wanted to get his book published and avoid at all costs the delays and strains of a long trial. Magnificence of the spy catcher case. But what we see is while the over-the-top reaction of the British government to Peter Wright is echoed in the reaction of the Americans to Assange, and with the same counterproductive result, it must be said that the nature of the material Wright sought to publish was very different to the WikiLeaks revelations. The material published by WikiLeaks is very current. It is worth considering it in more detail. And then Malcolm Turnbull, demonstrating the expertise of a barrister who is entirely across his brief, runs through the release of the US Army video, which became known as the collateral murder video, the loss of the driver employed by Reuters. He goes on to talk about Manning. He says Assange had previously used WikiLeaks as a low-profile clearinghouse, receiving information and publishing it. On this occasion, he began the practice of releasing material in collaboration with established media outlets, which have since then included the New York Times, The Guardian, Le Monde, Der Spiegel, and the Fairfax broadsheets in Australia, among others. The original Army video was about 40 minutes long, and Assange edited it to make it, he said, more comprehensible. Needless to say, the editing was controversial, but it indicated he was doing more than simply letting the sun shine in. He was adding interpretation to revelation. He goes through the publication of the Afghanistan war logs, the more controversial publications, etc. And the speech is indeed, let me see, 13 pages long. No, I'm sorry, forgive me. It is 7 pages long with another page of footnotes. I have
actually, sorry, Ross. You were just about to say you tweeted it, so I was just going to say, if you can, it would be great for people to be able to examine that in a new unit of time. To really pick out some good quotes and tweet it.
So look,
tweet it to him.
Yes, so I've tweeted it at Ross Cameron 4. You can find it in my link to the fact that I was coming on the vigil. I will put that speech aside now. I simply conclude.
Actually, can I interrupt you a sec?
Go ahead.
People were just saying, brilliant, Ross Cameron, expose them all, and then people said this will be shared far and wide. So people are really loving what you just read. So feel completely guilt-free for having read all that. I think it was very important.
Well, look, thank you so much. I confess to you secretly, as a WikiLeaks kind of groupie, that I was loving it. I regard it as the best speech Malcolm Turnbull has given in his life. And it's not my purpose really, my principal objective is not to embarrass Malcolm Turnbull, but to call him back to his former self, to recover the link to the higher angels in his soul, and to just refresh his memory that when an Australian citizen is threatened in this way, his Prime Minister should respond.
Sorry, I have to put myself on mute, so there's a slight delay. I can only say that if there was integrity in politics, we would be living on a different planet. The problem is exactly what you just exposed there. And I believe the man was a sincere person. I mean, I joked that he was just preparing for getting into office. But I think all of these people intend something that doesn't happen once they sit in the seat. And what we have to all do is support WikiLeaks and Julian Assange's vision of transparency. And now that you've really essentially made repeated his legal statement in defense of Julian, citing, you know, important decisions that were legally made that set a precedent, like, you know, I think it was the 1980 High Court, Sir Anthony Mason, where he says that he's not going to collude in continuing a secrecy where there's no legal precedent anymore to keep it secret. And I think that whatever people do now, they have to begin to go back in history and look at things just like you did, to re-inspire Prime Minister Turnbull. Maybe it must be hell being Prime Minister. I don't know. Maybe he's down in the mouth. But that was a very spectacular defense of Julian. So
I agree. I mean, this is one of the curious thing. If we make up one of those psychological word maps where all of the different words about a person, a public figure, are thrown up on a screen with different size according to the frequency of their use in focus groups, the word which follows Malcolm Turnbull is disappointment. And if I may say, at the risk of, presumption, I believe it is because of the distinction, of the contrast between what you see when Malcolm Turnbull is at his best. When he's at his best, Malcolm Turnbull can go head to head with anyone in the world. And yet, here we have a guy schooled, seared, almost launched by a legal case surrounding the publication of previously privileged and confidential information which had been leaked. And that was, like the art of the deal for Donald Trump, or the Dollar Sweets case for Peter Costello in Australia. It was kind of a moment in his life that launched him, that is seared on his brain. And I just wish to say, then we had this brilliance, this individual flair, this apparent refined judgment and capacity to make the case, then has been met with this deafening silence of Malcolm as Prime Minister in office. And that is where this sense of disappointment comes from. But it is not my purpose to punish, embarrass, or sort of morally lecture the Prime Minister. Merely my hope, along with all of us watching, joining, participating, listening, just to call on Malcolm Turnbull to go back to his roots, to his natural impulses, and do everything in his power to defend and protect this Australian citizen, beginning with the issuing of his passport, followed 5 minutes later by the linking of this marvellous speech to Sydney University Faculty of Law to the Prime Minister's Department website, where it should be at the very top of the page.
I completely agree with you, and I think that's an awesome challenge. I really hope that everybody watching this, now and later on when people cycle through it, if you're Australian, I think you should do anything you can think of to realise exactly what Ross just said. And I think that maybe prime ministers need some encouragement, need to feel that they've got public support. And I think it would be, I know that in America, they say something like, if 10 people sign a petition, it's the equivalent of, 1,000 people signing it in terms of, public opinion. So I think really people just need to get all encouraged and communicate with the Prime Minister. I mean, I doubt that most people think that it means anything to communicate to the Prime Minister. But if you do it, it might really give him some courage to stand up and feel he'll be publicly supported.
Well, look,
or do you think I'm, sorry, or do you think
no.
I'm granting him too much sensitivity?
No. I'm saying that as a former retail politician myself, who never won an election by more than 3%, and usually by sort of less than 1%, I can assure you that even the most callow, venal, and self-serving politician is alive to sentiment. And your suggestion that people should contact their local member of parliament, contact the Australian Prime Minister. Forgive my discourtesy, not sort of directly looking at you. I was trying to find one grab from this extensive speech with which to leave you, but it was a remark given under oath by, I think it was Gates, to a US Congressional Security Committee, in which they said they had, here we go. This is my last little bit, because people can get the whole, on the Twitter feed, but this bit I want people to see, because there are lots of good faith conservatives, and while I know those watching come from across the political spectrum in this vigil, and that's one of its beauties, I am a guy, an unreconstructed Neanderthal conservative, who would have voted for Donald Trump on every possible occasion I had the opportunity. But I know there's a broad cross-section of political views who love Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And one of the genuine concerns that people raise in their critique of WikiLeaks is that they can't support Assange because he put lives at risk of those who were trying to do their jobs, trying to do the right thing, trying to help the United States, and that therefore this was an act of recklessness which should be punished. And just as we referred to Justice Mason's decision in the Commonwealth and Fairfax 1980 High Court requiring evidence of serious harm, we had to be able to say that would not just cause embarrassment or controversy or debate, but you had to be able to show serious harm. We have, from Malcolm Turnbull's lips, it is worth noting that many people, including myself, expressed great concern that these reports would compromise current operation and put lives at risk, especially those of people assisting the United States. The anxiety is relevant to all the WikiLeaks revelations, particularly so when such a large amount of documentary material is released at once. ... Nonetheless, it should be noted that in October 2010, US Defence Secretary Gates responded to a congressional inquiry by stating that the review of the leaks conducted by the United States had not, this is a quote, had not revealed any sensitive intelligence sources and methods compromised by the disclosure. So this is the US Secretary of Defense is saying that the release of the US cables, the diplomatic cables, did not satisfy the second test of the High Court of Australia's test, that it would cause obvious and immediate harm. So we know that the material was neither still secret at the time it was released, so it fails the first test, and we know that according to US Secretary Gates, the leaks had not revealed any sensitive intelligence sources and methods compromised by the disclosure. It fails both tests. A game, set, match. Julian Assange is an innocent man.
I think you've made the case as if you're embodying him again in 2011. I just feel that the legal principles behind this are tragically not the point to those who are practicing gangsterism, because those are the laws that Julian is being subject to now. And I think that the more that people recognize that this isn't in any way justifiable, that it is gangsterism, that, sorry, I've just got a message from Susie saying the other guest is here. But I think that what you've said and the fact that you took the time to read all that is very valuable, and people can go back and listen to that, and better still, go to your Twitter feed, which is, what's your Twitter feed?
It's at Ross Cameron 4.
There we go.
4.
Right. And you will be tweeting out the link, presumably, to that speech.
It's already gone out.
Okay.
Just before I came on, yeah.
Okay, brilliant. So people should look at that and forward it to other Australians, especially. And I would say have some compassion for the Prime Minister. Have some understanding that the unity that exists between us, despite all our political differences, I have to believe that even if he's not capable, because he's being constrained from acting on his own integrity, he may get inspired to step forward. He might get some chutzpah and actually do something for Julian. And I think in the spirit of as Australian, fairness and toughness, I think he might do it. So get out there, people, and encourage your Prime Minister. Give him some balls back.
Amen. Sister Vivian, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to your next guest.
Oh, yes. And thank you so much. It's so brilliant that you came on. And I thank everyone, and particularly thank you for sparing me the complication of having to ask you questions. So, thanks. Bye, Ross.
Bye now.
Bye now. So...